What if I told you that the history of the United States, the version you were taught in school, the one printed in your textbooks, the one carved into the plaques of your national monuments, is not the beginning of the story? What if it is, in fact, the cover story? Not a mistake, not an oversight, a deliberate surgical removal of an entire chapter of human civilization from the official record. Right now, as you watch this, there are maps sitting in university archives, some digitized, most deliberately obscured, that show a version of North America so different from what we've been told that most people, when they first see them, assume they must be fakes, fictional, fantasy cartography. They are not fakes. They are older than the nation itself, and they show cities, roads, river networks, population centers, a functioning advanced civilization spread across the interior of this continent, a civilization that, according to every textbook ever printed, did not exist. And then, between approximately 1800 and 1880, within the span of a single human lifetime, it vanishes. Not gradually, not through war or disease or migration, documented and recorded and grieved over. It simply stops appearing on maps. New maps replace the old ones. New histories are written. New cities appear, strangely quickly, in strangely perfect locations, along rivers and trade routes that seem almost pre-planned. New populations are said to have settled vast territories that the old maps show were already, unmistakably, occupied. The question is not whether something was here before. The question, the one that should keep you awake, is who decided you were never supposed to know about it, and why. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a document trail, an architectural record, a map anomaly that spans dozens of archives across 4 continents. This is the reset. And tonight, we are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Every investigation begins with a document, and this one begins with dozens of them, stored in places like the David Rumsey Map Collection, the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. These are not fringe sources. These are the most respected cartographic archives on Earth. And when you look at their earliest maps of North America, not the ones they put in the school curriculum, but the ones from the 1600s and early 1700s, you begin to notice something that the official narrative has never adequately explained. Interior cities. On maps produced by Guillaume de Lisle in 1703, on maps by Herman Moll in 1715, on the extraordinary Carte de la Louisiane et du cours du Mississippi, produced for the French royal court in 1718, you see settlements, named settlements, with what appear to be road connections, river access points, and in several cases, geometric layouts suggesting planned urban design. Not indigenous encampments, which European cartographers of that era marked with entirely different symbols. These are marked with the same iconography used to denote cities. A location near the modern site of St. Louis shows a settlement labeled with enough cartographic authority that it appears on no fewer than 6 independent maps produced by cartographers from 3 different nations, France, England, and the Netherlands, who had no coordinated reason to invent the same fiction. By 1820, it is gone from every map. By 1850, the official narrative has Lewis and Clark discovering this same region as untouched wilderness just 4 decades earlier. The question cartographers and archivists have quietly asked for over a century and never been funded to fully investigate is simple. How do you lose a city? Not a village, not a campsite. A settlement significant enough to appear consistently on the premium cartographic products of multiple European empires. You don't lose it by accident. Now let's talk about something you can see with your own eyes. Not in an archive, not in a university library, on the street. If you walk through the oldest preserved sections of cities like Cincinnati, Ohio, settled officially in 1788, or Natchez, Mississippi, officially established 1716, or Cahokia, Illinois, where the official record admits to pre-Columbian earthwork mounds of extraordinary engineering complexity, but offers no coherent explanation for who built them or why they then disappear from all subsequent habitation records. In all of these places, you will find the same anomaly. Buildings whose ground floors are partially or entirely below street level. Not basements, ground floors. First-story windows that peer out at the boots of passing pedestrians. Front doors accessible only via steps that descend down from the sidewalk. Ornate architectural detailing, the kind reserved for facades, for public-facing presentation, located on floors that are now underground. The official explanation for this phenomenon is what urban planners call street raising, a deliberate municipal decision to raise the level of the road surface above its original grade. And in some cases, like Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871, that explanation is well documented and credible. But here is the problem. The street raising explanation requires several things to be true simultaneously. That dozens of independent cities across thousands of miles of American territory all made the same unusual architectural decision across the same approximate historical window, with almost no surviving municipal records of the decision being made, funded, or debated. Street-raising projects are expensive, they are controversial, they generate enormous public record, petitions, budgets, engineering surveys, newspaper debates. For Chicago, those records exist. They are extensive. For the dozens of other American cities showing the same sunken ground floor phenomenon, the records are either absent, fragmentary, or suspiciously vague. What the mud flood theory proposes, and what makes it so persistently compelling, regardless of its fringe status, is a far simpler explanation. The ground rose. Not through municipal engineering, through a catastrophic depositional event. A rapid, continent-scale accumulation of sediment, debris, and displaced earth that buried the lower levels of existing structures, killed or displaced the populations that inhabited them, and provided the incoming settler civilization with a landscape that appeared empty, open, and available for the taking. A civilization didn't end. It was buried. And the buildings that survived, half swallowed by the new earth line, were repurposed, renovated, and handed a new history.
Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children, orphans and foundlings from the overcrowded cities of the eastern seaboard, were loaded onto trains and shipped westward. They were called the orphan trains. The official history presents this as a charitable resettlement program, the brainchild of Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society of New York, designed to give homeless urban children a fresh start in the open farmlands of the American interior. It is one of the most remarkable social programs in American history, and almost no one talks about it. Think carefully about what this program implies. If the American interior was genuinely a wilderness, recently settled, slowly civilized, why was there such urgent, organized, institutional pressure to populate it so rapidly? Wilderness doesn't need 250,000 children delivered by rail within living memory of the nation's supposed founding. Wilderness needs time. It needs generations of slow settlement, gradual land clearing, incremental infrastructure. The kind of growth you can see year by year in the settlement records of genuinely new colonial territories. What the orphan train program looks like when you remove the charitable framing is a repopulation effort. The deliberate, organized introduction of a new human population into territories that, according to the old maps, according to the architectural anomalies, according to the geological evidence of rapid sediment deposition, had not long ago been home to someone else. Someone whose children were not being sent west, because they were already there, or had been. This is one of the darkest implications of the reset hypothesis, and it must be stated carefully. We are not suggesting a specific perpetrator, a specific group, or a specific conspiracy with named individuals at its center. What we are suggesting is a pattern of rapid depopulation, rapid repopulation, architectural inheritance, and historical replacement that repeats with disturbing consistency across the American interior between 1800 and 1880. The orphan trains are the most legible piece of that pattern. 250,000 children delivered by rail to fill a continent that was not, in fact, empty. Here is a question that architectural historians have never answered to anyone's satisfaction. How did a nation of frontier settlers, operating with hand tools, horse-drawn equipment, and a population of under 10 million people, many of them recent immigrants with no specialized skills, construct, within the first 5 decades of the Republic, some of the most technically complex, aesthetically refined, and structurally ambitious buildings in the history of Western architecture? Let's be specific. The United States Capitol building, as we know it today, with its iconic cast-iron dome, was completed in 1868. The dome itself weighs approximately 8.9 million pounds. It was assembled during an active civil war by a nation simultaneously fielding armies of hundreds of thousands of men, managing a collapsing economy, and suffering unprecedented civilian casualties. The dome's design is so technically precise that modern structural engineers, analyzing it with contemporary computational tools, describe it as operating at the absolute edge of what the material science of the era should have been capable of. Cast iron at that scale, in that geometric configuration, with those tolerances, it should not have been possible. It was not only possible, it was done in 8 years. Move west. The Pennsylvania Railroad stations, particularly Broad Street Station in Philadelphia, constructed 1881, display a Romanesque revival architectural vocabulary of such density, such ornamental complexity, such sheer material volume, that construction timelines recorded in official history simply do not compute when compared against modern construction benchmarks for equivalent structures. Broad Street Station's main hall contained a barrel-vaulted ceiling spanning 300 feet without interior column support. The stonework was hand-carved. The iron framework was hand-fitted. The official record says it took approximately 4 years to build. 4 years. For a structure that modern engineers, equipped with hydraulic cranes, pneumatic tools, computer-assisted design, and prefabricated components, estimate would require 8 to 12 years under optimal conditions. The explanation the alternative history community has long proposed, and which mainstream academia has long dismissed without adequate refutation, is elegant in its simplicity. These buildings were not built by the young American Republic. They were inherited by it. They were pre-existing structures, remnants of the advanced civilization whose fingerprints are visible on the old maps, whose cities are encoded in the cartographic record, whose lower floors are now buried beneath a continental mudline. That the new American civilization found, repaired, repurposed, and then quietly claimed as its own. The construction records were either fabricated after the fact or referred to renovation and finishing work on existing shells, not to the original construction of the structures themselves.
And the men credited with designing them? Many of them left behind remarkably thin primary source documentation of the actual design process. The drawings exist, the specifications exist. The builder's correspondence is often strangely vague or strangely late, appearing in the record only after the building itself was already standing. If you want to understand the reset, if you want to find the moment where the hidden history comes closest to the surface, where the seams of the official story are most visible, you need to look at the World's Fairs of the late 19th century. Specifically, the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. These three events, staged within a 28-year window, presented to the world an astonishing proposition: that the United States of America, a nation barely a century old, still raw from a devastating civil war, still actively engaged in Western expansion, had somehow produced architectural achievements equal to or exceeding those of ancient Rome. The 1893 Chicago exhibition, known universally as the White City, remains the most discussed and most anomalous of them all. Official history tells us the following: 14,000 workers operating in a Chicago winter constructed over 200 major buildings across 690 acres in under 2 years, transforming a sand and swamp lakefront into a gleaming, classical city of white marble and gilded domes. The buildings were so grand, so technically accomplished, so ancient-feeling in their proportions and aesthetic vocabulary, that visitors from Europe, accustomed to the actual ancient buildings of Rome, Athens, and Paris, reportedly wept upon seeing them. Frederick Loring Olmsted, who designed the grounds, described the experience of the White City as not merely impressive, but of another kind entirely, as though one had stumbled upon a civilization one had no right to encounter. That phrase, a civilization one had no right to encounter. Now ask yourself, why within a few years of the exposition's close were virtually all of these magnificent structures demolished? The official reason? They were built of temporary materials, staff and plaster, not meant to last. But photographs of the construction process tell a different story. The foundations were not temporary. The substructure stonework in several documented cases was not staff and plaster. It was solid limestone and granite, cut and fitted with precision that temporary construction does not warrant or require. And there is one more detail, noted by researchers studying the exposition's original building permits and contractor records. Several of the newly constructed exposition buildings appear in photographs taken before the officially recorded start of their construction. Not after, before.
In 1848, the United States government commissioned what would become known as the Pacific Railroad Surveys, a series of federally funded expeditions tasked with identifying viable transcontinental railroad routes across the American interior. The survey teams were not looking for mysteries. They were engineers, geologists, and topographers, practical men with practical mandates. What several of them reported in official survey documents that were submitted to Congress, printed in government records, and then, with the passage of decades, quietly ceased to be cited or referenced in subsequent official histories, was troubling. Survey teams working in the Missouri and Arkansas river basins repeatedly documented what their reports describe as evidence of prior extensive habitation: earthwork structures of non-indigenous design, road-grade clearings through terrain that had never, within any recorded period, been subject to American settlement, and in at least 2 documented cases, below-ground structural remains of cut stone construction. Cut stone, not earthworks, not timber, cut, fitted mortared stone in regions that the official settlement record shows were first reached by American pioneers within the same decade the surveys were conducted. The survey teams had no framework for what they were finding. Their reports describe the anomalies, attempt brief explanations, perhaps Spanish colonial remnants, possibly earlier French outpost construction, and then move on, because they had a railroad to route and a nation to build, and whatever was buried in the Missouri Basin was not going to stop either. But the reports exist. They are in the Congressional Serial Set, the complete record of documents submitted to the United States Congress between 1817 and 1980, housed in every major federal repository. No one has funded a comprehensive study of the anomalous habitation references in those survey documents. No one has mapped them. No one has compared them against the old cartographic record of interior settlements. Not because it would be difficult, because it would be inconvenient. Let's ground everything you've heard so far in the specific, because this is not speculation built on nothing. This is a reading of primary sources, architectural records, and cartographic documents that exist today in institutions you can visit, that you can examine yourself. The David Rumsey Map Collection, accessible online, contains digitized versions of over 150,000 historical maps. Within that collection are dozens of pre-1800 maps of North America showing interior settlement markers that align with no accepted pre-colonial indigenous territory and no documented European colonial outpost. The Sanborn fire insurance maps, produced from 1867 onward across thousands of American cities and towns, document the ground floor layouts of commercial and residential structures at the street level of their era. In city after city, particularly across the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Corridor, and the Missouri Basin, these maps show structures whose dimensions, proportional systems, and room configurations do not correspond to any known American vernacular building tradition of the period. They correspond with striking regularity to the proportional systems of classical European civic architecture, the architecture of a formal, established civilization, not a frontier settlement. The Historic American Building Survey, administered by the National Park Service, contains measured drawings and photographic documentation of thousands of American structures. Within its pre-1880 building documentation are multiple structures whose foundation systems are documented as significantly older than the structures built upon them. The Congressional Serial Set, Volume 18 from 1853, containing the preliminary reports of the Pacific Railroad Survey's Missouri River Division, includes an 1853 field report by survey engineer Lieutenant Governor K. Warren describing extensive earthwork features of non-natural origin along a tributary of the Missouri River in territory that, as of that date, had never been subject to American settlement. Warren's report is real. It is in the public record. His earthwork features have never been formally investigated. And finally, the photographic archive of the 1933 World's Columbian Exposition, housed at the Chicago History Museum and partially digitized by the Library of Congress. Within that archive are construction phase photographs whose metadata, cross-referenced against the official construction timeline in the exposition's own administrative records, contain at least 3 documented instances of fully completed building facades appearing in photographs dated before the official groundbreaking of those specific structures. Not renovation, not foundation work, completed facades before they were built.
Let's say, for the sake of this final argument, that you accept nothing we've shown you tonight. Let's say you look at the old maps and see cartographic error. You look at the sunken buildings and see mundane street raising. You look at the orphan trains and see charity. You look at the World's Fair photographs and see a metadata discrepancy too small to matter. You look at Lieutenant Warren's 1853 field report and see a junior officer being overly dramatic about a riverbank. Fine. Let's say all of that. There is still one question that none of these explanations answer. One question that sits at the center of American history like a stone in still water, and that every official account steps carefully around without ever addressing directly. Why does the 19th century feel so much older than it should? Not culturally, not technologically, architecturally. Walk into Union Station in Washington, D.C., completed 1907. Stand beneath its barrel-vaulted ceiling, 96 feet above your head, its 98-foot arched windows flooding the main hall with light. Look at the 46 Roman legionnaire statues lining the perimeter. Read the Latin inscriptions carved into the travertine walls. This is a building that a 130-year-old nation built to make itself feel ancient. Not impressive, ancient. Why? Walk through the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, completed 1888, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson. Stand in its granite courtyard and look up at its Romanesque tower, its round arches, its stone surfaces worn not by Pittsburgh's 40 years of reign, but what appears, to the eye, to the hand, to be centuries of weathering. Why does a building completed in 1888 look ancient? Builders of the American Gilded Age were obsessed, not merely interested, not merely influenced, but obsessed with making their structures feel as though they had always existed, as though they were rediscoveries rather than constructions, as though the civilization they expressed was not new, but restored. That is a very specific psychological posture. It is the posture of a culture that knows, at some level, institutionally, architecturally, in the hands of the men who cut the stone and signed the checks, that it is not building a new world, it is inheriting one. The reset, if it happened, was not a single event. It was a process, perhaps slow at first, then sudden, then covered over with the practiced efficiency of a civilization that had decided, for reasons we can only guess at, that the previous chapter would not be read. The maps were replaced, the buildings were reframed, the ground swallowed what it couldn't hide, and 250,000 children were sent by train to live in the houses of people who were no longer there to object. Here is what we do not know. Who initiated the reset, or whether it was initiated at all, rather than simply survived in the aftermath of something catastrophic that no surviving record has fully described. Here is what we do know. The evidence that something existed before the official story begins is not fringe, it is not fabricated. It is sitting right now in the Library of Congress, in the Chicago History Museum, in the David Rumsey collection, in the Congressional Serial Set. It is waiting, not to be discovered. It was never lost. It is waiting to be admitted. The American story did not begin in 1776. It began much, much earlier, and someone, at some point, made a very deliberate decision to make sure you would never know how it ended. The most dangerous thing about a reset is not that it happened, it is that it worked.